They say real power doesn't walk through the front door. It arrives unannounced, in silence, cloaked in shadows, until the world can no longer look away. On the morning of May 9th, 2025, a military jet sliced through Russian airspace, escorted by fighter planes like a secret being guarded by fire. It wasn't a Western president, nor a global billionaire. It was a 37-year-old captain from a landlocked West African nation, Burkina Faso, stepping onto the tarmac in Moscow, not as a guest, but as an equal. His name, Captain Ibrahim Traoré. A name once whispered in back channels, now chanted by thousands from the heart of Africa to the icy streets of Russia. But who is this man who walks like a ghost of revolutions past? Why did Vladimir Putin, a man known for calculated loyalty and strategic distance, not only invite him, but send a private plane to pick him up? Why were Russian fighter jets dispatched? Not for protection, but for symbolism. And most of all, why were other African leaders at the event treated like mere spectators, while this one man commanded the stage? This was no ordinary diplomatic visit. It was a cinematic arrival, a political earthquake, and a statement to the world that a new order was emerging, and it wore combat boots, not a business suit. Traoré's presence in Red Square wasn't just noticed. It was orchestrated, celebrated and feared. While the West whispered accusations and governments scrambled to decode the symbolism, African youth, activists, and exiled students flooded the streets, waving Pan-African flags and chanting his name like gospel. It wasn't diplomacy. It was theater. And the world had front-row seats. Just 2 years earlier, Traoré had taken power in Burkina Faso through a coup many dismissed as another footnote in a chaotic region. But unlike the ones who came before him, Traoré didn't beg for aid. He didn't smile for cameras at Western summits. He kicked out French troops, nationalized gold reserves, and openly aligned with Russia at a time when most African leaders still tread carefully between East and West. Now, standing shoulder to shoulder with Putin at Russia's 80th Victory Day parade, an event historically reserved for Moscow's closest allies, Traoré wasn't just participating. He was redefining the guest list. The question isn't just how he got there, but why the Kremlin treated him like royalty while others faded into the background. Every detail, from the red carpet to the jet fueled by Russian esteem, was a message written in symbolism. And the message was clear. This wasn't just about geopolitics. It was about defiance, about legacy, about a continent reclaiming its narrative one leader at a time. As the plane door opened and Captain Traoré stepped into Moscow air, clad in his signature military fatigues, the crowd erupted. Not because he was powerful, but because he was theirs. He didn't come to ask for favors. He came to declare alignment. To signal that Africa no longer waits for a seat at someone else's table, it builds its own. What happens next is a story that blends rebellion, diplomacy, and something far rarer. Belief. In a leader, in a vision, in the idea that maybe, just maybe, the world order we've known is already cracking, and from its fractures, someone unexpected is rising. He didn't need a throne. He didn't need a grand speech. All it took was his arrival, and the world knew everything had changed. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's touchdown in Moscow was more than just another state visit. It was a declaration dressed in silence, cloaked in intent. While other African leaders landed with full entourages, briefcases of talking points, and carefully rehearsed smiles, their presence quickly melted into diplomatic background noise. Traoré, on the other hand, arrived alone in glory, flanked by Russian fighter jets, aboard a private jet personally dispatched by Vladimir Putin himself. The moment screamed symbolism. It wasn't a gesture, it was theater. It was Moscow's way of saying, this is not just an ally. This is our man in Africa. And the continent heard it loud and clear. Traoré wasn't just another African president. He had become the moment. His face, stoic beneath his beret, appeared on TikTok edits, in YouTube documentaries, even in fan art across Instagram feeds. But here, now, on Russian soil, surrounded by the Kremlin's pageantry, the myth began merging with reality. Crowds gathered to witness his landing, not just Russians, but Africans living in exile, students, activists, and dreamers. They waved Burkinabe and Pan-African flags, held up homemade signs that read Traoré, the people's captain, and chanted his name like it belonged in the same breath as Sankara and Lumumba. The energy wasn't political, it was spiritual. Back home in Ouagadougou, the streets erupted. News that the young captain had been hand-picked by Putin for Russia's most sacred celebration, the Victory Day Parade, sparked spontaneous rallies, chants of solidarity, and street murals depicting Traoré as a lion standing beside a Russian bear. Social media exploded. Posts on X, formerly Twitter, from users like Natalie Orma captured the geopolitical shockwave. In a stunning twist of global alignment, Burkina Faso's President Ibrahim Traoré stands beside Putin in Moscow. Not begging, not apologizing, standing. The contrast with other leaders couldn't have been starker. While heads of state from Mali, Niger, and others were quietly shuttled in and out of photo ops, Traoré's every step was broadcast, documented, and amplified. He wasn't just attending history, he was the headline, and the West knew it. To understand why Traoré's presence hit so hard, you need to go back. Just a year before, in 2023, Burkina Faso expelled French troops and diplomats. It was a move no one saw coming. Especially not from one of the world's poorest nations. Yet Traoré made the decision with surgical precision. In doing so, he stripped away decades of neo-colonial influence with a single stroke and began shifting his country's gaze toward Moscow. Russia responded like a king meeting a kindred soul. They didn't just send weapons, they sent helicopters. They didn't just offer intelligence, they deployed security personnel to protect his regime. But beyond hardware, they gave him something even more powerful: platform. The chance to speak, to be seen, to be heard, uncensored, on the world stage. A luxury the West never gave to Sankara or Lumumba or Gaddafi. Putin gave it to Traoré, which explains the reception. This wasn't just about celebrating old military victories, it was about redefining alliances, and Moscow had made its choice clear. With every handshake, every salute, every camera pan that showed Traoré beside Putin, while others waited in the background, the message was unmistakable. Africa's rising star wasn't just a regional disruptor. He was a player in a new world order. But what exactly had earned him that place? For one, it was his defiance, his refusal to play by the old rules. Traoré didn't ask for permission. He took the wheel. He nationalized gold reserves and funneled profits not to oligarchs, but to national defense. He empowered local militias, the Volunteers for the Defense of the Homeland, VDPs, to protect their own people, even as Western media called them militias with undertones of chaos. But where critics saw instability, his supporters saw sovereignty. He's not a puppet, one Pan-African commentator posted. He's the first to cut the strings and still stay standing. And then there was his youth. At just 37, Traoré is the youngest head of state in the world. Where others leaned on tired talking points and worn-out diplomacy, he spoke with the urgency of someone who still hears the hunger cries of children and the fury of forgotten villages. His words weren't polished for donors, they were fire-forged from experience. And that authenticity pierced through borders, resonating not just in Africa, but across the diaspora, from Nairobi to New York, from Lagos to London. In Moscow, that resonance was visible. Traoré was more than a politician. He was a symbol, an icon of a generation disillusioned with the West's empty promises and tired aid packages. He didn't come to Moscow to be saved. He came to signal that the age of begging is over, that the tables have turned. Putin's embrace of Traoré wasn't merely diplomatic, it was strategic genius. While the US and France grapple with internal polarization and external mistrust, Russia is investing in symbolism, youth, and ideological clarity. And in Traoré, Putin found a man who checked every box: revolutionary, anti-imperialist, digitally viral, and geopolitically fearless. The jet, the military escort, the red carpet, those weren't just honors. They were declarations. They said, "This is who we're betting on." And in doing so, they pushed Traoré into a league of his own, one no longer defined by poverty rankings or Western validation, but by influence, visibility, and raw power. He didn't need to announce his arrival. His silence did it for him. Now, with eyes from every continent fixed on his next move, Traoré stands not just as a leader of a nation, but as the spark of a continental shift. His enemies are watching, his people are rising, and history is holding its breath. Because when a ghost becomes impossible to ignore, the only question left is this: what will he do next? Before Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood beside Vladimir Putin in Moscow, before the jets, the red carpet, and the crowd that hailed him like a prophet, there was a moment, a microphone, a room full of presidents, and a speech that would shatter the silence of a continent. July 27, 2023. St. Petersburg, Russia. The Russia-Africa Summit. Most expected another round of polite diplomacy, ceremonial pledges, and perhaps a few trade deals whispered between suits. What they got instead was a revolution in real time. And it began when a 35-year-old captain from Burkina Faso took the stage and asked the most dangerous question of all. How is it that a continent so rich is still so hungry? The room froze. But he didn't. He had warned them. He opened his speech with humility, apologizing in advance if his words offended the elders in the room. He thanked God for the health and safety of those present. He invoked tradition, invoking the spirit of the land of upright men, Burkina Faso's ancestral identity. And then, like a surgeon wielding fire, he cut open Africa's greatest wound. My generation does not understand, he said, his voice calm but heavy with purpose. Africa is rich. We have water, we have sun, we have land, we have people. Yet we remain the poorest continent. Why? A silence so deep you could hear the weight of history pressing down. These weren't words meant to impress Western donors. They weren't crafted for applause. They were confrontation, dressed as conviction. The young captain wasn't just speaking, he was indicting decades of betrayal, not just from colonial powers, but from Africa's own elite. He spoke of the presidents who jet across oceans not to trade but to beg, of youth forced into death boats across the Mediterranean, drowning for a future denied to them at home. She dies in the ocean, he said of Africa's daughters and sons, but one day she will not go to the ocean. She will come to our palaces asking for her daily pittance. In that line, he wasn't forecasting migration, he was forecasting reckoning. You could see it in the faces of the leaders in the room, some looking away, others shifting in their chairs. The Senegalese president, Macky Sall, tried to recover the moment, insisting that African leaders did not come here to beg. But it was too late. The sting had already landed. The truth had already been spoken, and it echoed far beyond those. Wall's clips of Traoré's speech hit social media like lightning on dry grass. Activists in Nairobi hailed him as the second coming of Thomas Sankara. In Lagos, youth organizations began printing his quotes on shirts. In South Africa, students held watch parties, replaying the speech like scripture. Across the diaspora, from Paris to DC, his words rang louder than any ambassador could ever hope to, but Traoré wasn't done. He turned his fire toward the West's so-called human rights rhetoric, exposing its double standards. He spoke of the Volunteers for the Defense of the Homeland, VDPs. Local militias formed to defend Burkina Faso from jihadist insurgents. Western media called them dangerous. But in Europe, when citizens take up arms to defend their homes, they're called patriots. Why the difference? Why the disdain for African resistance? He didn't just challenge the hypocrisy, he dismantled it. And then came the gut punch. A name. A place. Traoré, 1944. Traoré reminded the world of what happened when African soldiers, forced to fight for France in World War II, returned home and asked for their basic pay. They were slaughtered by the very system they had served. Our ancestors were deported to save Europe, he said, and when they came back and asked for justice, they were massacred. That moment wasn't just painful, it was precise. It was strategic, because it reminded everyone watching that colonization wasn't ancient history. It was recent, raw, and unfinished. And then, with the force of a revolutionary priest, he delivered his most haunting line yet. The slave, who cannot assume his revolt, does not deserve to be pitied. He wasn't asking for sympathy, he wasn't asking for favors. He was issuing a warning. Africa would no longer wait. It would rise, or it would fall trying. By the time he ended his speech with the words, "Homeland or death, we shall overcome," the room had transformed. It wasn't just a hall of presidents anymore. It was a tribunal of ghosts, Sankara, Lumumba, Nkrumah. They were all there, nodding in the echoes. What followed was more than just applause. It was movement. Youth-led protests across West Africa. #campaigns. A growing defiance against Western narratives. From TikTok to Telegram, Traoré became more than a name. He became a symbol, and that terrified the old powers. France, still licking its wounds from being expelled from Burkina Faso, watched nervously as the speech went viral. The US began casting doubts about how Burkina Faso's gold reserves were being used, accusing Traoré of enriching his junta instead of his people. Think tanks issued reports. Embassies went quiet because deep down they knew something had shifted. This wasn't just about Burkina Faso anymore. It was about a new generation of Africans who no longer saw the West as their savior, but as their former captor. It was about an ideological torch being passed, not through handshakes in Geneva, but through fire on the streets of Bamako and the rallies of Ouagadougou, and through it all, Traoré stood still. He didn't flinch, he didn't soften, he doubled down. His speech in 2023 wasn't an anomaly. It was a blueprint, a warning, a war cry. And by 2025, when he stepped off that plane in Moscow, the world saw not just a captain, but a commander of ideas, a man who had turned words into weapons and belief into strategy. The old world wasn't ready for it, but Traoré didn't come to be invited. He came to claim the mic and burn the script, May 2025, Red Square, Moscow. Under the weight of cold skies and the memory of Soviet sacrifice, two men stood shoulder to shoulder. One, the architect of a multipolar vision that has defied NATO and outlasted economic warfare. The other, the youngest head of state in the world, scarred by betrayal, forged by fire, and now baptized by the full weight of geopolitical theater. This wasn't just symbolism. This was the moment Captain Ibrahim Traoré stepped fully into history, not as a guest, not as a disruptor, but as a partner, equal, strategic, intentional. The Victory Day Parade, Russia's most sacred political ritual, had never featured an African head of state in such an elevated position. But here was Traoré, not tucked away in a row of obscure dignitaries, but in full view of the world, standing beside Vladimir Putin as fighter jets roared overhead and Soviet anthems echoed across Red Square. The message was deafening. Africa has chosen, and this is its man. For the West, it was a geopolitical nightmare wrapped in pageantry. For the Kremlin, it was a masterstroke, but the road to that moment was no accident. Since his takeover in September 2022, Traoré has remade Burkina Faso into something few outside the Sahel could have predicted, a revolutionary laboratory. He didn't just cut France loose, he torched the framework of dependency they left behind. He expelled French troops, revoked military agreements, kicked out diplomats, and reoriented Burkina Faso's defense and resource strategy toward Russia. In return, Moscow delivered not just weapons and helicopters, but presence, trainers, intelligence experts, and, according to open-source intelligence, up to 300 security personnel embedded within Traoré's inner defense system. But what tied these two men together wasn't just mutual utility. It was shared resentment, a disdain for the West's moral lectures, selective human rights outrage, and long history of exploitation wrapped in aid packages. Putin, long cast by Western media as the villain of the international order, saw in Traoré not just an ally, but a younger reflection. Like him, Traoré came from a military background. Like him, he spoke with blunt force, not diplomatic flourish. And like him, he rejected the notion that power must be filtered through Western approval. So when Traoré nationalized Burkina Faso's gold reserves and redirected the profits to fund security and local infrastructure, the West called it reckless. But in the halls of the Kremlin, it was seen as visionary. Where others saw rebellion, Putin saw alignment, a shared doctrine. A mutual challenge to the post-World War II power structure that has kept the global South in check through loans, sanctions, and smiles. That's why when the Victory Day invitations were sent out, only one African leader generated headlines before even landing. Only one had a private jet dispatched, flanked by military escort. Only one sparked rallies in Moscow before his plane even touched down. And that man was Ibrahim Traoré. It wasn't about prestige. It was about narrative. By placing Traoré front and center during Russia's most sacred celebration, Putin wasn't just honoring him, he was investing in him, in his youth, in his virality, in his growing cult of personality across African youth networks. Unlike many other African heads of state who rule with fear or stagnation, Traoré rules with momentum. His speeches don't end when the cameras turn off. They live on in TikToks, WhatsApp threads, university debates, and protest chants. And in an age of attention wars, that makes him not just relevant, but dangerous. This digital messiahhood hasn't gone unnoticed. AI-generated images of Traoré as a Pan-African warrior, robed in golden armor or flanked by eagles, circulate widely online. Short videos of his 2023 summit speech now include dramatic music, subtitles in multiple languages, and animated graphics. To the old guard, it may seem absurd. But to the next generation, online, angry, mobilized, it's scripture. And Putin, ever the strategist, has made sure those images travel faster than any diplomat could. Kremlin-backed media outlets across Africa now routinely feature Traoré's speeches. Russian language courses in Ouagadougou are offered for free. School competitions themed around sovereignty and resistance are sponsored by Russian-affiliated NGOs. In back alleys and on university walls, graffiti of Traoré and Putin shaking hands now sit beside murals of Sankara, Che Guevara, and Nelson Mandela. But it's not just cultural. The alliance is tangible. Russia has secured access to Burkina Faso's mineral wealth, gold, manganese, and potentially lithium, in exchange for sustained security support and diplomatic amplification. For Traoré, this isn't colonization by another name. It's transactional sovereignty. "We deal as equals," he reportedly told his inner circle. "They don't tell us how to govern. They ask what we need." The West, meanwhile, is struggling to keep up. U.S. officials have accused Traoré of funneling gold profits into personal protection rather than national upliftment. France has gone quiet, unsure whether to re-engage or retreat completely. Regional bodies like ECOWAS, once influential, now find their influence hollowed out as Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso band together in what some have dubbed the Sahel Bloc, an anti-Western confederacy aligned more closely with Russia and increasingly China. The economic freedom fighters in South Africa released a statement praising Traoré for his courage in breaking the psychological chains of neocolonialism. In Nigeria, student unions cited him as the most inspirational African voice of the decade. In the diaspora, his image now appears on protest signs in cities like Paris, Toronto, and New York. He's not just a political figure anymore. He's a symbolic insurgency. And yet, for all his popularity, Traoré's alliance with Russia has raised urgent questions. What happens if he becomes too powerful, too independent even for Moscow? Will he be allowed to truly chart his own course, or will the same external forces that crushed Sankara decades ago come for him next? Is Putin playing the long game, or simply using Traoré as a pawn in his broader geopolitical chessboard? For now, the partnership holds, strong, public, strategic. But history has taught us that global alliances, especially those rooted in anti-hegemonic sentiment, are fragile, volatile, and often short-lived. Still, for the young Africans who watched him walk across Red Square with confidence, who heard his voice echo with conviction, who saw his jet descend through Russian skies like a divine signal, the message was clear. Africa isn't just knocking on the door anymore. It's building a new one, and in the center of that new entrance, etched into its frame, is the image of a man in fatigues, standing beside a man in a suit. both smiling, both aware, and both rewriting the rules the world once swore were unbreakable. History rarely announces itself. It doesn't knock politely or wait to be invited. It arrives uninvited, loud, disruptive, and irreversible. On May 9th, 2025, in the shadow of Red Square, history arrived wearing two faces. One was familiar: Vladimir Putin, the strategic architect of Eurasia's resistance against NATO. The other, unexpected, unshaken. A 37-year-old military captain from a former French colony, standing tall, not as a subject of history, but as its co-author, Captain Ibrahim Traoré. That image, two men, two timelines, two continents, standing shoulder to shoulder during Russia's most symbolic national celebration, reverberated like a thunderclap across the geopolitical landscape. It wasn't just a photo op, it was a signal to the global south, to the global north, and especially to Africa. Your story is changing, whether they like it or not. From the moment Traoré's boots touched Russian soil, it was clear this visit wasn't about protocol. It was about power. Not the kind handed out at summits or negotiated in back rooms, but the kind forged through defiance, vision, and sacrifice. The jet that carried him, the fighter escort, the red carpet, each detail was a carefully crafted message. Russia wasn't just deepening diplomatic ties with Africa. It was betting everything on one man's ability to ignite something far greater than a trade agreement. A revolution of perception, and ignite it, he did. Back in Burkina Faso, the streets of Ouagadougou erupted in celebration. Thousands chanted his name, Traoré, our hope, as if he had just scored the winning goal in a match that had lasted for centuries. Similar scenes played out in Mali and Niger, where citizens now see Traoré as not just their neighbor, but the ideological nucleus of the Alliance of Sahel States, a new bloc that openly rejects Western-backed institutions like ECOWAS and the CFA franc. In South Africa, the economic freedom fighters praised his unrelenting resistance against neo-colonial pressures. Their statement read like scripture: Traoré is proof that Africa's spine is not broken. It is merely awakening. But the tremors weren't confined to Africa. In Washington, Traoré's alignment with Russia sent shockwaves through the State Department. For years, US diplomats had dismissed the rise of anti-Western sentiment in Africa as fringe rhetoric. Now, they were watching it parade proudly through Moscow's Red Square, flanked by nuclear-capable bombers and the loudest anthem of Russian pride. In Paris, the reaction was quieter, but no less tense. Still reeling from being expelled from Burkina Faso, French officials reportedly viewed Traoré's visit as a strategic humiliation. One diplomat, anonymously quoted, described it bluntly: "This is Africa flipping the bird to the west, on a Russian stage. And yet, the impact goes far deeper than diplomatic discomfort. It's psychological, cultural, viral. On social media, Traoré's speech clips, especially his 2023 dismantling of African dependency and Western hypocrisy, have reached tens of millions. TikTok edits now remix his words with Sankara's, with Malcolm X, even with Kendrick Lamar. AI-generated art depicts him as a modern Moses, parting the sea of global injustice. Children in Ghana and students in Soweto wear shirts with his image, emblazoned with his signature phrase: "The slave who does not revolt does not deserve pity." It's no longer just a slogan, it's a doctrine. And here's the part the West still doesn't fully understand. This is no longer about one country. This is about imagination. The idea that a small, landlocked nation could reclaim sovereignty not by begging or apologizing, but by walking away. By choosing a new path. By looking east when the West turned deaf. What Traoré represents now is much bigger than himself. He is the walking contradiction to everything Africa was told to believe. That you must be rich to be respected. That you must follow rules written in Paris to get support. That your history of resistance is dangerous and outdated. That your youth should migrate, not organize, but the youth are organizing. And they're doing it around a figure who was never supposed to be center stage. A captain, not a king, a soldier, not a scholar, an outsider, not a groomed diplomat. Undercover messiah. They believed he was just another transitional military leader, but what they missed was this. He listened more than he talked. He studied quietly. He watched how power moved, and when the time came, he didn't ask for it. He took it. That's what makes Traoré different from others before him. He didn't rise with fanfare. He rose through force and forged legitimacy not through Western applause, but through action. He nationalized gold reserves and used the wealth not to enrich elites, but to arm the people defending the land. He dismantled French military bases not as a symbolic gesture, but as a strategic pivot toward unfiltered independence. He embraced Russia, not blindly, but because it offered something no Western country would. Partnership without patronizing. And yet, even Putin must know this alliance, while powerful, is temporary. Built on aligned interests, not eternal loyalty. Both men know history's cruel habit of turning today's comrades into tomorrow's competitors. But for now, they stand united in a single truth. The old world is dying, and the new one will not be born in silence. This is the era of multipolar resistance, of digital defiance, of ideas that spread faster than bullets. Still, questions remain. How long before Western intelligence agencies try to destabilize him? How long before old allies become suspicious of his growing influence? Will he survive the storm he's created, or be consumed by it? For now, none of that matters. Because right now, the continent is watching. The world is watching. And Traoré, once dismissed as just another coup leader, is writing his name into the soil of something far more permanent, something viral, and something that cannot be undone. He stood in Moscow's Red Square like a general who had never lost a war, not in the battlefield, not in ideology, not in the story he was writing. But as the drums of celebration faded, a new rhythm began to rise, not of parades, not of cheers, but of whispers, in Washington, in Paris, in Brussels. In hidden meeting rooms and encrypted cables, a single question started echoing louder than the anthems. How do we stop him? The answer wasn't on a battlefield. It wasn't with tanks. It wouldn't come from a public speech. No, the answer would come in silence, in strategy rooms, cyber cells, and economic choke points. The West didn't need to assassinate Captain Ibrahim Traoré to bring him down. They just had to starve the idea he represented. And that's where the shadow war began. Intelligence reports, unconfirmed of course, suggest that Western analysts began monitoring Burkina Faso's telecoms more aggressively after the Moscow visit. Washington's National Security Council quietly flagged the Sahel bloc, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger as strategic volatility zones. Paris, still stinging from its expulsion, ramped up its influence in neighboring Ivory Coast, hoping to contain Traoré's spread. ECOWAS, under diplomatic pressure, issued soft warnings against extra-constitutional governments without naming names. But everyone knew. The target was clear. Traoré wasn't just a threat because of his speeches or his alliances. He was dangerous because he had momentum. And momentum, in geopolitics, is harder to kill than a man. Reports began surfacing that US-aligned NGOs were being probed or expelled from Burkina Faso. Foreign aid pipelines started shrinking. Behind closed doors, Western diplomats warned private contractors to avoid investing in the region. Banks hesitated. Insurance firms balked. Economic isolation, wrapped in the language of compliance, was being deployed like a weapon. Quiet. Cold. Effective. Yet Traoré didn't blink. Instead, he leaned deeper into the alliance with Moscow. In late 2025, a joint task force was announced between Burkina Faso and Russian defense contractors, not just for military training, but for cybersecurity. Kremlin-backed media intensified their coverage, painting Traoré as the hero of a new, Pan-African order. Meanwhile, African social media, particularly in youth-driven spaces, erupted with defiance. TikTok edits now featured the caption, "Africa isn't alone anymore." And that terrified the old world. See, this wasn't just a military problem, it was a narrative war. Western media struggled to contain the growing admiration for Traoré among African diasporas. Young Africans in London, Toronto, and Atlanta began holding rallies, not for their local elections, but for the man in fatigues half a world away. Murals began appearing in Johannesburg and Dakar with two flags side by side, Burkina Faso and Russia. The symbolism wasn't subtle. It was revolutionary, but the pressure wasn't letting up. By December 2025, rumors began swirling of internal dissent within Traoré's circle. Foreign intelligence agencies likely smelled an opportunity. Every coup attempt in Africa, no matter how small, was now analyzed as a possible Western countermove. Traoré knew it, his people knew it. That's why his rhetoric began to sharpen. In a late-night broadcast, he warned, "The hands that feed betrayal do not always wear uniforms. Sometimes they hold contracts, or cell phones, or smiles." It was a warning not just to his enemies, but to those close to him. The war was no longer about weapons. It was about control of the mind, the screen, the currency, the signal. And in this new battleground, the West was no longer invincible. The empire wasn't falling, but it was being questioned, loudly, visibly, relentlessly. And at the center of it all was a captain who never wanted to be king, but was becoming something more dangerous than either. He was becoming believed.